So that's kind of the landscape for auto portability. I'll introduce Jack by saying kind of along this journey that we've been taking with Employee Benefit Research Institute, we asked a question one day. We said, you know, EBRI, if there was perfect portability in the system, meaning the only leakage was hardship withdrawals, and we figured out how to keep loans intact as people change jobs, what would that all look like? And that is the cue for Jack to get up and talk about the latest research that EBRI has performed on portability. Thank you, everybody.
Appreciate the introduction, but given the first things you said, I was kind of hoping there'd be a karaoke machine up here for when I start singing, but I guess I'll have to go without one. What I'd like to do today is give you two quick oversights on the potential magnitude of the kind of systems Spencer's been talking about. You'll notice in the title I'm going to be talking about two different things. First, we're going to worry about just what happens during the accumulation phase, in essence, until people hit retirement age, which I'm just going to go ahead and assume for today is going to be age 65. And then we're also going to go the next step and try and figure out exactly how much difference this might make with respect to retirement deficits. So we're going to add a decumulation or retirement phase onto the modeling. And then at the very end, show basically how this ranks with respect to some other proposals that have been floated recently, one, of course, being an auto IRA on a federal basis instead of a piecewise state basis. And another one, not that we're ever going to use the M word here, but instead of a mandate, to look at something like a universal defined contribution system, where if every employer had in essence established a DC plan, how much difference that would make. So basically trying to get to these various access problems. Okay, I guess we're doing this instead. Marcine. Thank you. So a very quick overview. Doing only the accumulation part first. I'm going to be simulating three different scenarios for you. One is going to look at full portability, and what I mean by that is I'm going to assume every participant is going to consolidate their savings in their new employer plan every single time they change jobs. So in essence, we're going to end up with people at age 65 with all their money in a single account. So there will still be leakages in the system, but the only leakages we're going to be modeling are those that apply to hardship withdrawals. Secondly, I'm going to do what I'm going to refer to as a partial auto portability, and this goes back to some points that Spencer made. So in this case, anytime there's a participant who has an account balance less than $5,000 adjusted for inflation, we're going to consolidate their account balances every time they change jobs. So again, for those people with amounts less than $5,000 adjusted for inflation, the only leakage we'll see is hardship withdrawals. To do a comparison vis-a-vis what we have in place today, also I have to do a status quo, our baseline. So in this case, in addition to the hardship withdrawals, which are being modeled in the first two, I'm also going to have a participant-specific probability of cashing out as well as loan default leakages at job change. Now, what I'm going to be doing in the next couple of graphs for you is, first of all, show you the present value, so these will be in today's dollars, the accumulations at 65, or in some cases when I do various time horizons, because I show you how this plays out over 10, 20, 30 years, etc., under both the full and the partial alternatives, and I'm going to be comparing that with the status quo. I'm going to segment it by a number of different things. We're going to look at how this works by age cohort. We're going to look at how this looks by age-specific income quartiles. And then, as I mentioned, I'm also going to do it over to various time horizons. And then we're going to finally finish up by comparing the retirement deficit reductions. So this will bring in the stochastic decumulation module for full auto portability with some alternative reform scenarios. So again, just first of all, looking only at the accumulations. The next couple of slides will only take you out to age 65. We'll get to the decumulation in a couple of minutes. What you get under the full and the partial alternatives here are basically played out over the next 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. So if you go all the way to the right-hand side and let this basically factor in for everybody currently 25 to 64, track them until 65, you'll find that we're coming up in present value terms for the full situation of about $1.9 trillion. Now, to put this in context, if you would take the present value of all the 401k contributions being made today and you grow them at about a 4% wage growth and then discount them back at 3%, even with a simple 5% rate of return, that turns out that $1.9 trillion turns out to be about 6.7% of that present value of overall contributions, just to put that in context. So to focus first of all on those numbers in the red under the full alternative, it starts out where you have about $472 billion after 10 years, and you can see how that grows out to about $1.9 trillion after 40 years. If you look at the difference, though, between that and the partial, where again the partial is anybody $5,000 or less indexed for inflation, you see you still get a substantial portion of that, and that basically goes to Spencer's earlier point, how many small accounts there are. We still end up after 40 years with about $1.5 trillion present value in additional accumulations if you do have auto portability with a $5,000 limit. Now, how does this play out by age? Comes as no surprise here, I'm sure, to anybody in the crowd that it's going to be a lot better for the young people than the older people because they're going to have that much more time to benefit from this. If you look at the full for people currently ages 25 to 34, we come up with about an extra $847 billion. For that same age cohort, for the partial, it's $659 billion. By the time you get out to the end, though, there's relatively small numbers, 41 billion, for the partial and 74 billion for the full. If you want to look at it by age also, what I've done here now, instead of giving you dollar values, I've tried to look at how much in percentage terms, on average, the account balances will increase. So if you look, for example, at people on the left-hand side in the lowest age-specific income quartiles, we find that for people, again, there's going to be the age impact you would expect. For the youngest cohort, 25 to 34, we get almost a quarter increase, 24.6% for the youngest people. That obviously goes down with age. By the time you get down to the oldest cohort, 55 to 64, you're only giving about a 2.1% increase over the account balances. And as you would expect, you do have somewhat of a decrease going from lowest to second income to third income to highest income quartile. But if you really want to see where that plays out, going from the partial auto portability to the full auto portability, those numbers now jump dramatically. Remember, the bar on the furthest left-hand side of the previous graph for the partial was 24.6. Under full auto portability now, the lowest income quartile for the youngest age cohort, 25 to 34, we get a 36%, more than one-third, 36% increase in average account balances for these individuals. Again, these numbers will decrease with age, and they also decrease with income quartile. By the time you get to the highest income quartile here for the youngest cohort, that 36% drops all the way down to 26%. So that very quickly is where we ended up in terms of looking at the accumulations for today, but I really wanted to spend some additional time looking at what this means in terms of retirement deficit reductions. Now, for those of you not familiar with the simulation model that basically Craig Copeland and I put together in the late 1990s and have used on a national basis now since 2003, I won't go through all the specifics, but I just want to point out the model ends up producing two different output metrics, one of which we call a retirement readiness rating, which is just simply what's the probability that you will have a successful retirement. And by successful, I simply mean that you're not going to run short of money as long as you're still alive. Now, that's a useful way of looking at various proposals, but obviously ignores the fact that if somebody is going to run short of money, it makes a lot of difference whether you're going to run short by a couple $100 or maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the other output metric we produce from this model is called a retirement savings shortfall, RSS, and that's what we're going to be looking at in a couple of seconds, where in essence what I do is I take the present value of all the deficits you have starting at age 65 and I bring it back to today. So in today's dollars, it's telling you how much additional money you would need on an after-tax basis in your account at age 65 to eliminate the retirement deficits that we're simulating. And again, when we do this model, we look at, because it's a stochastic model, we look at longevity risk, we look at post-retirement investment risk, and most importantly, we look at long-term care risk. So all of these are included. Overall, if you want to take a quick summary of our model, we're not going to go through this today, but we find for all U.S. households between the ages of 35 and 64, the overall aggregate present value of all those deficits turns out to be $4.1 trillion. So that's the additional money they would need in their accounts to basically wipe out these simulated deficits. So where do we end up? Well, let me, before I tell you where we end up with the Auto Portability, let me give you the other two programs that we're looking at in comparison. If you look at the bottom of this grid, the first one is the Auto IRA. And what we've done, again, instead of doing the piecewise state-by-state basis that seems to be evolving right now, we went back to the first proposal from the Obama administration that had this, where in essence you would be talking about every employee who's not currently with an employer. It's going to have a DB or DC plan, and we avoided any size exemptions on this, would in essence automatically have a 3% deferral. Now, I am being incredibly generous in my assumptions on this because I'm assuming there are no opt-outs on this. Now, obviously, we're going to get some experience. Oregon is having a pilot test that's starting very soon, and we're going to see exactly what kind of opt-out rates we might see in these state auto IRAs. But even under the most heroic assumptions, we find that, for example, if you look at the number for the people 35 to 39, and again, for any one of these proposals, the youngest cohort is going to be doing a lot better than those people on the verge of retirement. There's simply not enough time for those people on the verge of retirement to benefit sufficiently from these. But if you look at the grid in the left-hand side, the top number, that 11%, what that's saying is if the auto IRAs went in today and nobody ever opted out of them, that you could reduce that $4.13 trillion by about 11% for that portion of that for the youngest cohort. Now, the number under that, the 28% for universal defined contribution, again, we're saying just how good could the current system be if everybody basically had access to an employer-sponsored defined contribution plan. So what we're saying is if you currently work for an employer that doesn't offer a DB or DC, that the employer will offer you something that looks like other employers in that firm size. And typically larger employers are more likely to have auto enrollment. Larger employers typically have more generous packages, so all that's reflected in this. But as opposed to my heroic assumptions for auto IRA, I use very realistic assumptions in terms of what I'm modeling for the universal DC, given the EBRI-ICI 401k database we have on 24 million individuals from 70,000 plans. We've been able to track this over time, and basically these are real empirical opt-out rates. These are real empirical contribution rates, so basically everything's reflected in here as close to reality as possible. And in that case, we find, again, let's focus on the very youngest cohort, the people 35 to 39, that their specific retirement deficits can be decreased by 28%. Okay, so 2 times more than what we have for the auto IRA. So take that as kind of the boundaries. 11% is as good as you can get, even if no opt-outs occur under auto IRA. If you do a universal DC, you can get at 28%. Now, the reason I want to bound this for you is, remember, those are assuming every single person, in essence, is going to have access to a retirement system. What we're talking about in the kind of program Spencer mentioned is not doing anything to access. Now, we can talk about later on, if we had an expansion where everybody was eligible, what that might do to the kind of numbers that we're coming up with for auto portability. But when I run the auto portability model, the full model, not the partial model, the full model through the system, you see the bottom number and the left-hand side of the grid, 20%. I can end up decreasing the deficits for the youngest cohort by 1/5 without even touching access, just given the people who are currently eligible for the system. So it's a very, very significant overall decrease in terms of the retirement deficits. And again, if you were to interact this with another kind of system that would give you increased eligibility, obviously those results would increase. So in the next couple of minutes, as far as the next steps on this, we're still working through some of this. I should mention, under some of the alternative assumptions, I used incredibly conservative assumptions in terms of coming up with the first part of that on the accumulations for you. This is something that we had done for the World Economic Forum, and I continued using that. We're going to be updating some of our cash-out assumptions, especially with respect to what we have found in some of our recent experience with the 401k data providers in our database. And then finally, we're going to modify our IRA withdrawal parameters. Those of you that have tried to model this in the past probably have a pretty good idea how difficult it is to figure out if people aren't showing up in the auto portability but in the baseline. If they have rolled over from a 401k to an IRA, obviously there's still a lot of withdrawal activity going on pre-retirement. We're working together with ICI on some different types of estimation procedures right now on this. So right now we're basically using SOI data to try and get a handle on that. That's going to be a little bit more refined, hopefully in the next week or two. Under structural design, we're going to do some alternative auto portability thresholds. All I showed you today was either the $5,000 index for inflation or basically everybody. Spencer mentioned the $15,000. That's going to be included, as well as $10,000 and probably some additionals. There is nothing in what I currently have that includes auto portability leakage. I'm currently assuming that if you're in auto portability, that basically you're going to stay out of the, quote, leakage bucket if you miss it the first time. That's something that I'm working with Spencer on to get some additional information to see, for those people that do end up in auto portability, are we going to basically be seeing them later on, in essence, doing a pre-retirement withdrawal. And then finally, behavioral assumptions, and I would love suggestions, comments, data, whatever, on something like this. But if you're going to model this for a second round of estimates. A lot of things that we really don't have any information on, I think, need to be explored. If you're going to tell your employees, for example, that there is this universal auto portability, is it going to affect participation and contribution? People may, even if they're being told they have the opportunity to opt out of this, they may think that that's going to decrease their pre-retirement access to these funds. And I think we know already from whether or not a plan offers loans, for example, that if people realize they have access to those funds pre-retirement in case of a financial hardship, especially the low-income people are much more likely to A, participate, and B, if they do participate, contribute at a higher rate. So there may be some behavioral feedback on that. Again, that's pretty difficult given any empirical data right now to get an assumption on, but that's something we're thinking through. Asset allocation, I mean, it might even drain down to whether or not people invest more conservatively if they at least think they're not going to be able to get their hands on that money prior to age 65. And then finally, I think the biggest unknown here is what about plan design parameters? Would employers in an auto portability world redesign their 401k plans? Are employers basically trying to optimize around the current scenario where they realize there is a great deal of cash out activity, as Spencer already mentioned? If so, would that mean that they could become maybe less generous because they assume those funds are going to stay in later or longer, excuse me, or is this just going to be basically status quo going forward? So these are all things we're going to be working on with Spencer. Any suggestions, comments? Please let me know. I think my email address was there, just VanDerhei@EBRI.org, or feel free to talk to me later on. Thank you very much.
Anybody have any questions? Otherwise, we'll turn the podium back over to Harry, and thank you very much. Oh, no. Sir, yeah, more than one. Yeah.
The universe of people you're studying, when you get up into the older segment, the number of variables, includes a large number of people whose behavior may be affected by the fact that they grew up and worked their way through in defined benefit plans, as I did, for example. Yeah. Whereas the youngsters, the ones in the 20, even 30, perhaps even 40, never lived under a defined benefit plan. So their behavior, I assume, when you talk about need, their behavior is governed to some extent by whether or not they have a fallback, because they know they got Social Security, they got a defined benefit coming when they're 65, and so on. When you project forward 20 years, 30 years, when not a single person in the working population, or hardly anyone in the working population, will have worked a day under a defined benefit plan, does that change in the universe have to be taken into account within your projections?
Want to take a shot at it? Sure. Great. If you give me about another 3 hours, I'll explain everything I've done to try and deal with that. We have a way of basically parsing out for a portion, I'm not talking the full EBRI-ICI 24 million participants, a portion of the database which allows me to know whether or not those particular plan sponsors, A, have a DB plan, B, is it frozen? And so I'm able to get a cleaner picture of that under the assumption currently, to be honest with you, that a frozen DB in terms of affecting their behavior is pretty close to having no DB at that particular point in time. So those filters go in to the estimation of the contribution behavior. But I will tell you, I mean, your hypothesis was exactly where I started when I started doing that. What is essence much more relevant to predicting contribution behavior is not necessarily whether or not there's a active DB accrual going on, as much as what are the incentives to contribute at each 1% point of compensation. So I know we've heard this a million times, but if somebody's getting a 50% match up to 6% as opposed to 100% match up to 3%, the fact that if you're in that first one, you have much higher probability of showing up contributing at the 4, 5, and 6% levels than somebody in the first one. And when you go through and control at a percentage by percentage point differential, and this is something Craig and I did, North American Actuarial Journal in 2001, if you want more specifics, that doesn't completely wipe out the effect that you had, but it explains much more of the overall difference, especially for the older cohort, than anything else we're seeing.
Oops, sorry. Sorry, Chair. Go ahead.
I saw some research recently that latent life job switchers are more likely to stay in the workforce, to work longer, and to work past 65. I'm just wondering if you or anybody else that you know of is starting to look at that segment in particular, what that means for portability, for all kind of policy issues that will raise.
I'm not sure we have specific data on that. We've found a couple of surprising things. So I'll go back to the small account segment. We found that something like 4% of that population with less than $5,000 are actually retirement age eligible. All right, and it's kind of stunning. As someone who's thinking about how long he's going to work, I can tell you that there are some behavioral changes that we're going to have to account for later. But let's look at reality today is that we haven't had a system of good, solid portability for everyone for forever, right, since the dawn of ERISA is the way I think about it. And there's a lot of catching up to do. So I think that's the first order of business, which is, sort of a horrific scenario. And we've actually helped some people with this. They get to age 65 and they've got 5 accounts, right? And getting them and gathering them into one place, which is not their employer plan at that point in time because they're not working there anymore, but getting them into one place, it's a lot of heavy lifting left to do in the system. So when I talk about auto portability, it's kind of in the early generation, there will be many, many other portability solutions that will be introduced along the way for situations like the one we just described. Yeah. All right, we should take one more so we can keep Harry on track here. Sure, ma'am. Oh, good.
Hi. Don't some record keepers automatically cash out small plans under 5,000 when an employee separates from service? And shouldn't we try to close that leakage at the same time?
Close. It's not 5,000 anymore. After EGTRA, an employer-based decision, you could cash out all accounts under 1,000, and that something like 90% of the plans do that today. We actually have most of our clients don't do that anymore. They just stop, and so we keep even the very small accounts in the system. From a behavioral perspective alone, that's a good outcome, which is we teach someone to even keep $600 saved and moved on to their new employer plan, as opposed to sending the wrong signal, which is we just sent you a check. It's like, ouch, that's not the right thing to do. So it's a great question. Too many involuntary cash outs today is our view. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time today.